In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 9, in which we go over the characteristics of perfect competition, where thus far we have gone through consumer choice in order to derive product demand, as well as the theory of the firm in order to derive product supply. Now we seek to examine varying market structures by putting product demand and product supply together in order to see price and output determination, similar to what we saw in Chapter 3, as well as examine firm profits, as well as consumer surplus, and given these varying market structures, what is the role for government intervention given price and output levels? Where with that said, in regards to this chapter, we will consider the market structure of perfect competition by considering its characteristics in order to go over its equilibrium and look at the profits generated by firms in this market structure. And in today's discussion, in regards to the characteristics of perfect competition, we'll go over some preliminaries in order to go over the characteristics of perfect competition and conclude with some examples. So to begin with our preliminaries, in our discussion of the theory of the firm, we saw that in order to develop a product supply, we needed the firm problem, and that firms maximize profits subject to the production constraint, but we also needed the market structure that the firm was operating in. We'll recall that market structure is the number of firms and relative size of firms in a particular industry. And in regards to market structure, we mentioned some of the following forms, where perfect competition is going to be our base case, and we also mentioned monopolistic competition, oligopoly, duopoly, and monopoly, where if perfect competition is our base case in which there's many buyers and sellers, each of which with no market power, as we move down from this list, we move to further deviations from our assumptions that are placed on perfect competition, in which we'll have fewer firms in the space and an increase in market power. And in regards to our discussion on these market structures, we will go over monopolistic competition, oligopolies, and monopolies in addition to perfect competition. The thing to keep in mind is overall that the type of market structure that a firm operates in will affect their decision-making process when they are profit maximizing. Now, moving on to our base case to what we did in the prior chapter, in regards to the theory of the firm, we assumed a perfectly competitive market so that we could look at a representative firm to examine the profit maximization process, where with our representative competitive firm, we looked at their short-run production function with fixed capital and variable labor and produced an output, where here we have our production function in which capital is fixed, labor is variable. We see that as labor is increasing, then output in the form of crops is increasing as well, but at a decreasing rate. And in terms of the profit maximization process, the firm does this on a marginal decision in terms of they look at additional production of a good or service, and they look at additional costs incurred from that production decision, as well as additional revenue generated from that additional good produced, and the additional sale that will be made. This gave us our profit maximization process that we see on the right, where additional costs incurred were in the form of marginal costs, which are upward sloping due to diminishing marginal returns. And in terms of additional sales generated from additional goods produced and sold, this gave us marginal revenue, and in the case of a perfectly competitive market, we have that marginal revenue is equal to the price of a good, since the competitive firm is a price taker. This allowed us to generate our profit maximizing condition of price is equal to marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So with all this in mind, we now seek to relax our base case by extending our discussion of a perfectly competitive firm to that of a perfectly competitive market. So to do that, let us first define perfect competition, in which it's going to be a market in which there's no buyer or seller with market power, in which we can define market power as the ability to alter the market price of a particular good or service. And in regards to the conditions in which we need to hold for perfect competition, it's going to be that there's many consumers and firms in the space that are considering an identical product in which both consumers and firms have perfect information in regards to the identical product, and firms are profit maximizing, and we can also include that consumers are utility maximizing, and there's low barriers to entry and exit within this space, and lastly, in regards to our firms, there's going to be zero economic profits. So let us take a look at our 6 conditions individually, where first we have many consumers and firms. This has the implication that as the number of consumers and firms in a market grows, the ability for a single agent to have influence over the market price will decrease. This assumption is what aids us in having that consumers and firms are price takers in our market, in that the more of these agents exist, if one particular agent tries to alter the market price, since there's so many other agents of that type within the space, it will be all for naught. We saw this in regards to our perfectly competitive firm in the last chapter in terms of they faced the horizontal demand curve, in that if they tried to price above marginal revenue or the market price, that none of the consumers in the market would purchase their good, and that since there's so many other existing firms competing and selling at the price point that equals marginal revenue, that firm that tried to price above it would lose all their sales, and the other consumers would just go to the existing firms that are pricing at marginal revenue. Second, we have identical products. Firms produce an identical product, and with this aids in the assumption that firms are price takers, in that if there's an identical product, it's likely that the production processes across firms will be very similar, and that there will be similar cost structures as well. So adding in place this due to many firms operating in the space, now with an identical product, which leads to similar production and similar costs, there's going to incentivize less deviation such that it reinforces price-taking behavior from the perspective of firms. Now moving on to our third assumption in regards to perfect information, this is going to be that all consumers and firms have complete information on product demand, product supply, and price, where without perfect information, the agent with more information on the product will have an edge over the agent type that doesn't, such that price could be influenced or overstated its actual value. Where an example where perfect information won't hold will be in the case of a used car sale, where it's going to be likely that the seller knows more information in regards to the car as well as the history of that particular vehicle as well. And from the perspective of the consumer, they likely don't make car purchases that often and likely do not know the history of that particular vehicle in question that they're purchasing as well. So given this asymmetric information, the seller can then use this to move the price of that car in question above market price, which could be avoided should there be perfect information on both sides. That is, the consumer also knows the vehicle and vehicle history information as well. So then moving on to our fourth assumption, this is just going to be a standard assumption that we're building in from firms, and we're putting this into our market structure in that we're assuming profit maximizing firms, and we already have that in terms of our firm setup, in which all firms are profit maximizers, and in the case of a competitive firm, they maximize profits at the rate of price is equal to marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And once again, this just follows by our setup from firms, and profits is the objective of the firm as well. We could also build in that consumers are utility maximizers, and they maximize utility at the rate of the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the price ratio. Moving on to our fifth assumption, low barriers to entry. Firms can enter and exit the market easily, in that should existing firms see profit in an industry, with low barriers, this will allow the firm to easily enter into the market space. Whereas on the other hand, should existing competing firms be at a shutdown point, with low barriers to exit, this will also allow the firm to exit once they are at that shutdown point. And lastly, in regards to our assumptions, we have zero economic profits, where with many profit maximizing firms in the space, as well as low barriers to entry, there's going to be pressure placed on prices as well as profits as a result, where the more firms existing in the market, the greater the pressure is going to be placed on price, and then the greater of pressure is going to be placed on profits as a result, which we'll explore later on in the chapter. But overall, we have that as more firms enter, we know that this is a non-price determinant of product supply, so this corresponds to a rightward shift. With a rightward shift in product supply, when we examine a market, when that market readjusts to a new equilibrium, it's going to be at a higher output level and at a reduced price rate. Well, looking at this from a profit perspective, with a reduced price on a particular good or service, for an individual firm, this means a lower marginal revenue curve, with a lower marginal revenue curve, this then means lower profits when they're going through their profit maximization process. And with those 6 assumptions, should they all hold for a particular good, we'll have a perfectly competitive market structure that we can analyze, and perfect competition, as mentioned, will act as our base case in terms of market structures, where the thing to consider, though, is that it's not the most common market structure that we'll see in the real world, given how steep some of these 6 assumptions can be. Though, regardless of that, some markets will operate similar enough to a perfectly competitive market, which we'll see in later chapters. Now, moving on to some examples of some markets where our 6 assumptions will hold. We'll have that for the case of an agricultural market that sells an identical crop in the form of potatoes, green beans, or corn, and this was our representative example that we worked through in terms of Chapter 8 of the agricultural market. A second one would be eBay in terms of how goods and services are sold, in particular with things such as trading cards. And lastly, we'll have the foreign exchange market in terms of currencies being bought and sold. Now, in regards to these later 3 markets, these are going to be deviations in which we would expect perfect competition to not hold. The first one being the soft drink market, where we can think about this in terms of soda, and if we look at our assumptions, there's only going to be a couple of firms operating in the space. Therefore, this violates our assumption in terms of many firms in the space, each of whom have no market power, where with few firms, each of these firms have a considerable amount of market power, and not only that, there's going to be barriers to entry in the form of high startup costs. Moving on to the electricity market, typically for a city there's only going to be one electricity provider, so this violates our assumption of many firms, and this one firm operating in the space has a considerable amount of market power, and there's huge startup costs to get started in terms of the electricity market, and so given that violation, we'd expect perfect competition to not hold. And then lastly, the skateboard deck market. The skateboard decks serve similar purposes in terms of they are highly substitutable, in terms of how they're composed, their material, and their dimensions, but given brand loyalty, there's going to be some market power for a particular skateboard deck brand, in which although there's going to be many firms, due to brand loyalty, there's going to be some market power associated with a particular skateboard deck, where given that, we would expect perfect competition to not hold.